Good evening, and thank you so much for such a warm welcome. It is my great privilege to speak with you about the topic of trauma and transformation. During our time together this evening, I would like to discuss 4 items with you. I would like to talk about some key factors related to trauma, some of the common effects of trauma, post-traumatic growth, and some of the steps towards healing. So to begin, first and foremost, as we all know, trauma is ubiquitous. In other words, it is everywhere. It is all around us. It has been a difficult year for so many around the world due to the global pandemic, the economic crisis, job loss, questions that many people are asking: how will I pay my bills? Ruptures in social connections, the apartness we have experienced, increased intimate partner violence and child abuse, and resulting mental health concerns. Consequently, the United Nations stated that although COVID-19 is in the first instance a physical health crisis, it has the seeds of a major mental health crisis as well. And in addition to the global pandemic, we have seen an amplification of awareness regarding racism and racial trauma that continues to surge around the world. In my own country, in the US, we have seen people blaming countries and races for the outbreak of the virus, both online and offline. And consequently, there have been peaceful protests, which have been so important. And there has also been rioting and looting. This summer, in my part of the world, in Chicago, United States, when rioting and looting began, stores shut down and larger police presence occurred. And our neighborhoods that previously seemed safe suddenly seemed unsafe. 2020 has been a difficult year for so many. Words are important. Words are imbued with meaning. So I'd like to take a look first, just briefly, at looking at the word trauma. Trauma is defined as events or experiences that are shocking and overwhelming. And they typically involve a major threat to our physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual well-being of individuals and their loved ones and friends. And these experiences can be sudden and unexpected, or they may be a one-time event. And for others, traumatic events may recur, and they may be continuous and chronic. Some examples of a variety of trauma include car accidents, sexual assault, tsunamis, violence in the family. There are mass traumas, and that can be massive flooding and destruction, or interpersonal traumas that happen by people we know, such as sexual and verbal abuse. And what's important to note about trauma is that what may overwhelm one person may not overwhelm another person. One individual may witness a gruesome car wreck and where people are traumatized, while an emergency medical technician may witness the same scene and they are not traumatized. And it's also important to know that some events may not be perceived as traumatic until weeks or months or years after the fact. Trauma can cause a variety of effects, and no two people experience trauma in exactly the same way. So, for example, some people experience traumatic loss. And we have all experienced loss during our lives. Grief can be heavy, difficult to carry. And grief involves the loss of someone or something. And that can be like the loss of a job or a home or resources, health, relationships. And over the years, I have worked with a lot of individuals who have experienced child sexual abuse. And some of their losses are the loss of innocence, the loss of beliefs that they previously held, like all adults can be trusted, or my loved ones are safe. And sometimes grief escalates into post-traumatic stress symptoms. And when this happens, it's like loss and PTS symptoms are thrown into one big emotional blender, and they're all mixed together. And here, loss can result in intense and pervasive and prolonged symptoms. Years ago, I learned a lot about grief from two 30-year-old horses. Yes, horses. Friends of mine live outside the city, and they grow corn and soybeans and cattle. And they had two 30-year-old horses. And these two horses were named Luther and Fred. And every time I would go to visit my friends, I would bring a bag of carrots so I could go see Luther and Fred first and give them some food to eat before I would go up to the house where my friends are. But this time, when I went to go see where Luther and Fred were, Luther was on the ground and he was sick and he had blood on him, and I knew something was terribly wrong. And so I went running up to the house and I called my friends and said, something's wrong with Luther. We went running out to the pasture, and we quickly saw, my friends looked at Luther and they called the veterinarian very quickly, and the veterinarian came to examine Luther. And when that happened, it was so interesting. When Luther was down on the ground, his old 30-year-old friend, the other horse, Fred, stood very, very closely to Luther. It was like he was trying to protect Luther from this veterinarian that he didn't know who he was. And so we gently led Fred away so the vet could examine Luther. And the veterinarian told us that Luther was dying. And the most loving thing we could do was to not allow him to go on living. And as we were talking, we saw Luther work really hard to stand up one more time. And then his old friend Fred walked in front of him, and these two old horses walked to the pasture, deep into the pasture one more time, and with tears streaming down our faces, we watched these two old friends go out to the pasture one more time. We gave them a little bit of time together, and then eventually my friend and I, we took Fred off to the side, and the vet and my other friend took Luther a little farther away. And the vet gave Luther an injection, and Luther died there. And as soon as that happened, my friend had a little tractor and he dug a grave for Luther because it was a very hot day and Luther needed to be buried right away. And then he started to drive this little tractor back to the neighbors who owned the tractor. And about that time, we let Fred go, the other horse. And as soon as we let him go, he started running after the tractor because it seems like he thought maybe that's where his friend Luther was. And when he realized that's not where his old friend was, he went back to the gravesite and he stood there and he began to whinny. And for horses, that's a way of crying. And he just stood there and began to whinny and cry. The next day, I called out to my friend's home and I asked them, "How is Fred doing?" And they said to me, "He's still standing out there." And that day it was pouring rain, and he was still standing by the grave of his 30-year-old friend, still whinnying and crying. And then the next day I called again, and still for 3 days he stood there whinnying and crying. And what those two old horses who had been friends for almost 30 years taught me, that if a horse could cry, and if God made horses to grieve, then it's important for you and I to be able to grieve too. That there is a time to laugh and a time to dance, and there is also a time to grieve. So some people experience great loss after trauma. Some people experience symptoms of anxiety following trauma. I read an article recently written by two physicians, and they had a patient that was presenting with the coronavirus, and this patient had a shortness of breath. And while a shortness of breath is a common symptom of the virus, after assessing, the physicians determined that the shortness of breath was more due to anxiety, fear. This patient was afraid of the unknown, fear, would they live or would they die? And the global pandemic has prompted many to experience higher levels of anxiety. And what is interesting is, in the brain, there is a tiny structure that serves as the alarm center of the brain, and it's called the amygdala. And the major task of the amygdala is to determine, is there a threat? We all need the amygdala in our brains. However, sometimes trauma can prompt an overactivity or an overstimulation of the amygdala, so that eventually, when there is no danger, the amygdala continues to sound the alarm saying, danger, 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 which can lead to chronic stress and heightened fear, anxiety, and can make it harder to calm down or to sleep. So in response to trauma, some people experience loss, some people experience anxiety, while other people may experience upsetting memories, flashbacks, where memories continue to play over and over again, kind of like a DVD that's stuck and plays the same scene over and over again. And for some people, these experiences linger and grow more intense. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental condition that includes flashbacks, may include nightmares, avoidant behavior where we avoid people or places that remind us of the trauma, and experience repeated thoughts or distressing thoughts about the event. And many people experience shame and self-blame, the belief, I should have done something to stop what happened. So while there are similarities in the ways we respond to trauma, there are also differences in the ways we respond. So, for example, if I was to line up 10 bottles up against a wall, and I was to push all the bottles down at the same time, they would all break differently. And so too with people. We all break differently. So with all this trauma and all these effects, it may prompt us to believe that the trauma is too big. We will never be able to heal. However, I believe trauma is not a life sentence, and it is possible to heal. There's a quote from Helen Keller. She lived in the 1800s to the mid-1950s, and she was the first person in the United States who was deaf and blind, and she earned her bachelor's degree. And she said this, Although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming. The mental health literature and the psychological literature has historically been lopsided or off balance. We have primarily focused on the negative effects, so that versus focusing on the fact that some people grow after trauma. So some people who have experienced negative traumatic events also experience positive mental health change. And what that is not is, it's not downplaying pain and suffering. All pain and suffering needs to be acknowledged. Rather, it is the awareness that some people who have been scarred by trauma have also been remade by trauma. When I was a little girl, there was a janitor at my elementary school who used to offer me candies. And he told me to come to the school and that when no one else was around. And so that day, on a Saturday, I went to the school and he told me not to tell anybody, because if I told other people, they'd want to come and get the candies too. So I went to the school on a Saturday and I didn't tell anyone. And he told me to knock on a door of a certain side door, and I knocked on that door and he led me in, and instead of giving me candies, he proceeded to molest me. Now, I didn't tell anyone about that abuse until my early 20s. I kept that secret for many years because I believed, like so many others who experience abuse, that it was my fault that this grown man had molested me when I was a little girl. But I got help and I shared secrets, and this healing was not a simple journey. And today I speak about child sexual abuse around the world, and tell people that abuse is wrong. But this very abuse that happened to me has now resulted in my life calling, helping others to break secrets so they can get help for child sexual abuse. So not only do people persevere through trauma, but they can even grow after trauma. And for some people, trauma does not destroy them. They gain wisdom and depth of character, even if they never understand why the trauma happened. Because often we may never fully learn why certain events in life happen. Post-traumatic growth is positive change that is experienced as a result of people struggling with a major health crisis or a life crisis or a traumatic event. There was a statement years ago by Winston Churchill who said, "Kites rise highest against the wind, not with it." I would like to show you a few slides that I collect slides to give glimpses of pictures of post-traumatic growth. So I'm gonna screen share right now. My first picture I'm gonna show you is about a tree. It's a large pine tree here. And one of my students sent me this picture several years ago. It's this pine tree in a state close to me. And people who have observed this tree have said that there's no reason that this tree should still be living. You see, the rock between where this tree is and the rest of the mainland broke away. And however, you see the tree's roots stretched across to the mainland so that the tree is still receiving the nutrients from the mainland while growing on the stone surface of this limestone over here. I think that this tree is an amazing picture of growth, even surviving, even when it doesn't make sense that something is surviving. I'd like to show you a second picture because I think we can often learn from the animal kingdom that demonstrates perseverance in very difficult conditions. The hummingbird is a tiny little bird. I don't know if there are hummingbirds in India, but in North America, there are these little tiny birds, and they're just a few inches long. And these tiny little hummingbirds, they're often called flying jewels. And they can fly more than 2,000 kilometers without stopping during their annual migration. And how these little birds get ready for their long migration is they begin by fattening themselves up, and they store extra fat for days, because as they go on their journey, they lose about half of their body weight during their journey. And they are amazing, persevering little birds. And I would suggest that some of you are like these little hummingbirds, that you are persevering during difficult life events, and that you keep going even when it has been so very hard. The third picture I want to share with you is a picture in Provence, France, where I traveled a couple of summers ago with dear friends of mine to a region of the French Alps where we ate the best of baguettes, and in the mountains we hiked and hiked and hiked. And each morning, my friend and I walked by fields of lavender, and that they would often call these fields of lavender, we would see like seas of purple. And we would smell floral aroma of lavender. And we would hear the symphony of bees collecting nectar. It was truly breathtaking. And these are the places, this place in the world is the place where the distilled oils of lavender create some of the famous perfumes in the world. And yet, what was so remarkable to me was the soil. It consisted of red clay, and it was full of rocks. And when I saw it, I was stunned that anything could grow in these horrific conditions, this red, rocky clay. And I found out years before, many Parisians also thought nothing could grow in these horrible soils of Provence. But lavender is hardy, drought-resistant, heat-tolerant, and it grows in low nutrient soils. And some of the people I have met in life have experienced harsh experiences, and they have suffered greatly. And yet they exhibit deep beauty, a lack of hate. And despite growing in these horrific soils of life, they are like lavender, and they bring beauty despite what they have suffered. I recall one woman that I worked with who had spent times on the streets in prostitution. And she grew up in a family where there was violence every day. And her father left her mother, and her mother was an alcoholic, and her mother's boyfriends were very cruel. And she experienced extensive physical and sexual abuse by many of her mom's boyfriends. And eventually she learned to believe that sex was all she was good for in life. And she spent years on the streets. And she told me at one particular point in her life, she would wake up every morning thinking, I need to get my little girl a new pair of shoes. And she would think, I've got to hustle. I got to get my little girl a pair of shoes. So she would go out and prostitute herself, but the money she made would quickly go to purchase the drugs, so she didn't get her little girl a pair of shoes. And when I met her, She was in a 2-year residential treatment program, and she was off of drugs, and she was off of the streets, and she was facing her trauma, and she was healing. And with a huge smile on her face, she told me about her part-time job that was through this residential treatment program, and that the money she made recently, she bought her little girl a pair of shoes. And she was so proud that she could do that. And she told me, I didn't prostitute myself to buy those shoes. There were a lot of reasons that that woman shouldn't have been alive. And yet, she was on a new journey and healing, growth despite the difficult soils of life. Paradoxically, some objects in life, some people in life intensify in beauty after being broken. So I want you to imagine, if you will, you are at home and accidentally knock over your treasured vase given by your favorite aunt. And now this vase is smashed into tiny pieces. What will you do? Do you try to put the vase back together again with glue and tape? Or do you collect the shards and dump all the vase into the garbage and determine the vase is a total loss? Or do you pick up the colored pieces and make something new, like a colorful mosaic? Each year I ask my students to get into groups and to develop a list of items that intensify in beauty after being broken. Over the years, this list has gotten longer and longer. And some of the things that students have come up with over the years are breaking eggs, diamonds, giving birth, a broken spirit, breaking world records, olives crushed turned to wine, quilts where little pieces of material are ripped apart into a lovely quilt, meteor showers. The list is long. Imagine if all of us this evening brainstormed together and thought of items that intensify in beauty after being broken. And I would imagine many of your names would be on that list as well. The transformation of trauma involves holistic mental health care, and it includes the body, mind, and the soul, healing of all parts of us. And you know, from the cancer literature, we know that some patients want their oncologist or their cancer physicians to inquire about religion or spirituality as a way to cope with cancer. Some cancer patients perceive the quality of their care to be much better when their spiritual needs were also addressed. And also, from the research, we know that spiritual coping activities when dealing with trauma can increase the mental health well-being of individuals and reduce their symptoms. Not too long ago, I read this fascinating economics article, and it was by a researcher and an economics professor from the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And this study was on the daily Google searches on prayer relative to all the Google searches. And it was between January 29 to April 1st, 2020, and it was for 95 countries. And what this researcher found was that the Google searches for prayer across 29 countries were at the highest level ever recorded between January and April of 2020. And they also found that the Google searches regarding prayer were not driven by a few of these 95 countries. Rather, the search on prayer was a global phenomenon. And the prayer searches rose more in economically challenged countries. But the impact was due to the countries being more religious, so that people who were in more religious countries were more likely to engage in prayer searches, which makes sense. What this study showed was that it appears with uncertainty and adversity, this leads some people to pray, stemming from that longing for comfort and care from the divine. In closing, I want to discuss a few signposts about the healing journey from trauma to transformation. Number one, it's important to find trusted, wise people to talk about painful experiences with. Trusted counselors, trusted, wise people can help individuals gain perspective about events that have happened in life. You know, if we try to read a piece of paper and we put it right in front of our eyes and we try to read it, it's too blurry, it's too close. So we need others to help us take a step back, to see things differently, to look from a different perspective, to see things that we couldn't see before. Wisdom from important caregivers can be helpful. And I would suggest it's very important for those caregivers to be people who have faced their own disappointments, people who have broken their own secrets, people who have learned to accept the things that they cannot change and the courage to change the things they can. Second, remember we talked about the fact that there's a part of the brain that is the alarm system of the brain that's called the amygdala. And trauma can overstimulate the amygdala. And it can result in the amygdala staying overactive, overstimulated, even when it doesn't need to be. And healing this part of the brain, the amygdala, involves learning to practice diaphragmatic breathing, or this belly breathing. I believe God designed the body in such a way to quiet down this part of the brain. We need to practice this deep belly breathing. And what researchers tell us is, neuropsychologists tell us that we need to practice this for this deep breathing, not this short chest breathing, but the deep breathing where we breathe in through our nose, hold on, and then breathe out. We need to practice this for at least 45 seconds to begin to quiet us. And what we know from neuropsychologists as well is that regular deep breathing practice can quiet the amygdala. But we need to practice this about 20 minutes a week. And that can be 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there. You can do that while you're laying down at night, sleeping, or preparing to go to sleep, practicing this deep breathing. In order to quiet down that overactive part of our brain that keeps saying danger, danger, and keeps us on guard, rather than being able to relax and to rest. And I think it's a beautiful thing that we can practice deep breathing wherever we are. You can do it quietly. You can be doing it right now, practicing this deep breathing as a way of quieting us. Third, seek supportive relationships. We cannot heal alone. We were made, and we have this irresistible need for community and companionship. I need my people in my life, people I can laugh with, people I can cry with, people I can be with. And you need this too. We all need trustworthy, supportive people who know all about us and accept us and love us just like we are. And sometimes it takes time to develop these friendships, especially sometimes when we've been hurt in relationships before. It can take a long time to ask somebody, could we talk or could we get together? Supportive relationships, but we need that to help us to heal. Third, hope. We are radically hope-based creatures. In 1952, Florence Chadwick determined she was going to swim from the Catalina Islands in the Pacific Ocean to the mainland of California. And she was the first woman who had already swam the English Channel both ways. And the day came that she was going to swim from the Catalina Islands to the mainland of California, and the weather was very foggy and chilly. And she could hardly see the boats that were accompanying her. And she swam about 15 hours. And then there came a point where she begged the people who were in the boats around her, she begged them to take her out of the water, that she was physically and emotionally exhausted. And they pulled her out. And it wasn't until she was on the boat that she discovered the shore was less than half a mile away. And at the news conference the next day, she said, "All I could see was the fog. I think if I could have seen the shore, I would have made it." Sometimes in life, all we can see is the fog. We need support of others in the boats of life around us to stand and hope with us, and sometime to hope for us when we feel like we have no hope left. And we need true substantial hope, not anchored in wishful thinking, to help keep us going. And finally, holistic healing journey involves paying attention to the body, mind, and soul care. Attending to our spiritual connection with God who loves us, to pour out our hearts, to tell him about our joys and our sorrows, to share our tears so he can comfort us, carry us, and quiet us. I had a praying mom, and I don't remember her ever telling me or preaching me sermons that I should pray. I just remember that when people called our homes and they shared their sad stories with my mom, she would cry with them, and she would listen to them, and she would grieve with them, and then she would ask them, "Could I pray for you?" And she taught me, when she died, I found stacks and stacks and stacks of prayer journals with my name on them. And I saw pages and pages and pages where my mom prayed for me. I saw stacks of journals where for my brother and how she prayed for him and for her grandchildren. We need praying, we need prayer, and we need praying people to help us to go through the journey of life. Thank you.